Iran is in crisis, facing military tension and economic pressure, and yet many people don't see the pattern behind it. There is an ancient prophecy that calls Iran by its former name, Persia. And this prophecy isn't hidden away in a corner. It's at the center of the prophetic chessboard, connecting the Middle East to the north, to unexpected alliances, and to a scenario that places Israel in the crosshairs of an international coalition. In 2025, reports pointed to a direct conflict between Israel and Iran, with the participation of the United States. And this rekindled fears of regional escalation and even a larger war. The question is, why does the Bible mention Persia as a key element of the end times? And why does this seem to fit so well with today's headlines? Stay until the end, because the most shocking part isn't the judgment. It's the exit door that almost no one sees. The Bible treats Iran in a way that no geopolitical analyst does. It sees it as Persia, a nation with a complete prophetic arc from beginning to end. In the same biblical narrative, Persia appears as an instrument of God to liberate the Jewish people from exile and support the reconstruction of the temple, especially in the figure of Cyrus, cited as a king used by God even before he was born. In other words, Iran doesn't enter biblical history merely as a villain. It enters as proof that God moves empires without asking permission from empires. Daniel, living in the context of the Great Kingdoms, describes the transition from Babylon to the Medo-Persian Empire, and his visions include symbols that point directly to this power that dominated the region. This matters because when the world looks at modern Iran, it sees only one state, one regime, one nuclear program and military alliances. But the prophecy looks to the spiritual line behind the nation. The same territory that once served the restoration of Israel reappears linked to a coalition rising up against Israel in the last days. This role reversal is what makes everything unsettling. How does a nation go from being an instrument of liberation to a piece in a prophetic siege? Furthermore, if prophecy has already described the path, is what is happening with Iran merely politics, or is it a warning to the entire world? The central prophecy most connected to Iran is in Ezekiel chapter 38, where Persia is listed among the participants in a coalition advancing against Israel. This detail is explosive for a simple reason. The text doesn't say a generic enemy. It mentions Persia, and this creates a direct link between the ancient world and modern headlines. Ezekiel describes this offensive as something that comes like a storm, involving multiple peoples and regions with a coordinated movement. This is where many people go wrong. They try to turn this into date prediction, when in fact the prophecy is building a pattern of convergence. From the current perspective, this pattern aligns with the fact that 2025 saw direct military tension involving Israel and Iran, with attacks on facilities linked to the nuclear program and an Iranian response with missiles. And when this clash occurs, it is not restricted to the Middle East. It immediately pulls the United States, pulls Europe, and affects the market, diplomacy, and global fear. That's why the Middle East remains the prophetic epicenter of the world, because any spark there can turn into a planetary crisis in hours. Ezekiel describes a coalition, but what is the password that will make the world accept an even greater escalation without realizing that it is entering a prophetic scenario? In 2025, a news report states that the Iranian president described the country as being at full-scale war with the United States, Israel, and Europe, and the text mentions a 12-day conflict in June with deaths on both sides. The same report states that attacks hit nuclear facilities, air defense networks, and targets linked to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and that the Iranian retaliation killed people in Israel. This makes the world hold its breath because Iran is not just a regional actor. It is linked to the issue that most terrifies governments, which is the line between deterrence and catastrophe. A report cited regarding a review of the Iranian nuclear program states that the International Atomic Energy Agency expressed safeguards concerns and cited the stockpiling of uranium enriched to 60%, treated as a serious proliferation issue. When this type of news is combined with Ezekiel chapter 38, the psychological effect is inevitable. It seems that the prophecy is describing the climate, not just the final event. And here Daniel comes in. His visions not only mention the Medo-Persian Empire, but also show that empires rise and fall in sequence, as if history were a train track. Modern Iran wants to prove its strength, survive pressures, and maintain influence. But the prophecy is saying that there is a spiritual limit to the arrogance of any empire. The question is the world only seeing the clash between states, or is it seeing the formation of a chessboard that can be used for something much bigger? To understand Iran in the prophecy, it is necessary to remember that it does not exist in isolation. It operates through networks, alliances, and indirect influence. Ezekiel chapter 38 describes a coalition, and the text cited in the archives itself connects Persia with other names and regions that many associate with a broad front against Israel. In the current scenario, what most closely resembles this logic are proxy wars and systems of pressure on multiple fronts, where no one signs off on the conflict but everyone fuels it. The end result is this: Israel is surrounded by crises, and the whole world reacts as if holding a trembling cup of fear. This opens the door for leaders to promise total solutions, total peace, total security, and that's where Jesus warned about deception and a world chasing easy answers in times of crisis. Iran, pressured by sanctions and an economic crisis, also faces internal instability, and reports speak of discontent and protests linked to a decline in purchasing power. This combination of external pressure and internal fragility often produces more aggressive decisions, because cornered regimes frequently try to demonstrate strength so as not to appear weak. And this creates perfect fertile ground for prophecy. A nation driven by need, pride, and fear, exactly the kind of fuel Ezekiel describes as a storm. But the most unsettling question is, who is using whom on this chessboard, and what is the spiritual price of this game? Daniel not only cites the Medo-Persian Empire as part of the sequence of kingdoms, but also shows that God knows the anatomy of power, how it grows, how it dominates, and how it falls. In the visions, Persia appears as a conquering and dominant power, and this creates a chilling parallel with the ambition for regional influence that Iran seeks today. However, at the same time, the prophecy makes it clear that no empire is invincible. What seems eternal today turns to dust tomorrow. This lesson is crucial for the public because it avoids two extremes: blind panic and naive confidence. Blind panic transforms Iran into an apocalyptic monster in every headline, and naive confidence treats the conflict as something manageable, only with diplomacy and sanctions. What prophetic texts do is draw attention to the invisible layer: human pride, shifting alliances, and a history converging on a test of loyalty, not just a redrawn map. And this is where revelation comes in. The book describes judgments and also describes systems, including the idea of a world where buying and selling can become instruments of control. When wars and sanctions squeeze economies, and economies demand control to survive, humanity begins to accept mechanisms that, in normal times, would be unthinkable. Then the question arises, is the conflict with Iran just war? Or is it a stage that prepares the world to accept control in exchange for stability? Ezekiel's prophecy is not just about an attack, but about a moment when Israel is the target of a broader coalition. And this changes the focus on Iran. It becomes a pawn, not a protagonist. And this is one of the most overlooked keys. In the prophecy, the focus is not Persia itself, but Jerusalem as the center of the global conflict. What we see today is that the Iran-Israel tension immediately triggers the agendas of global leaders and places the Middle East at the center of conversations between heads of state. In this scenario, Benjamin Netanyahu emerges as a central figure on Israel's security agenda and in talks with Donald Trump about the Iranian threat, according to the report. And Donald Trump, as President of the United States, enters as a decision-making force in alliances, deterrence, and escalation, and this always pulls Europe into the equation. The prophecy does not explicitly mention the United States, and this silence is strange because the country is a decisive military and economic power in the modern world. This prophetic silence may be more of a warning than an absence. Perhaps the text is describing systems and coalitions without needing to name all the powers of our time. The question is straightforward. What if Iran is merely the trigger keeping the world in a state of continuous fear until someone offers the grand solution? When the Bible speaks of judgment, it is not trying to entertain, it is trying to awaken. Before continuing, I feel that God has a special calling for you. I want to ask you to become an instrument to spread this message. Pause the video now, subscribe to the channel, and take the opportunity to leave your like. Every click you make can cause other people to receive this same video on their devices at this very moment, bringing this message to those who need it most. Don't wait. Do your part now. God may be counting on you to fulfill this purpose. Revelation describes trumpets and warnings, and the text in the files links these judgments to a logic of global upheaval, as if God were touching creation to reveal human frailty. Iran enters this climate because it is associated with the most intense modern fear, the fear of larger wars and nuclear fears, fueled by reports and confrontations. And while the world discusses warheads and sanctions, the human heart is being prepared to accept anything that promises stability. This is how deception gains strength, first through fear, then through dependence. This is how deception gains strength, first through fear, then through dependence. Europe, for example, has made progress in digital identity structures, and this shows how sophisticated societies are moving towards standardizing access and authentication on a large scale. This doesn't prove the final apocalyptic scenario by itself, but it shows that the technology needed to regulate buying, selling, and civil life can exist within an integrated architecture. And when this type of tool falls into the wrong hands, it becomes a silent weapon. There's no need to arrest them, just cut off access. The question is, how many people would resist such a system if it were sold as protection against terrorism, war, and economic crisis linked to the Middle East? Here is the most valuable point. The prophecy about Persia does not end in destruction. It includes the possibility of restoration, citing a promise as a sign that God still opens doors even after judgment. This changes the tone of the video. It's not just a geopolitical warning, it's a spiritual warning with real hope. Because if Iran is at the center of tensions, there are also real people there, real families, real lives, and God doesn't reduce people to chess pieces. The same God who used Persia to liberate and rebuild can reach hearts amidst collapse. And that's the part almost no one talks about when they turn prophecy into spectacle. Now that you understand this key, judgment that shakes, but also mercy that calls. The next step in this topic is even more serious. How the Iran-Israel scenario connects with Daniel and the type of control system described in Revelation. If God left a door open even for Persia, what does that say about the fate of any empire that today considers itself untouchable? Iran is not just the Middle East. It is a bridge between blocks. Vladimir Putin's Russia and Xi Jinping's China are frequently cited as strategic poles that approach partners when the West exerts pressure, and this affects the global balance. And Revelation speaks of kings from the East, creating an image of Eastern powers moving toward a global climax, which leads many to look at alliances and roots as signs of convergence. The archive analyzing 2025 speaks of tensions on multiple fronts and mentions that Israel exchanged fire with Iran and other actors, reinforcing the perception of escalation. The report on the June conflict describes the participation of the United States and Israel in attacks and makes it clear that this issue became central to conversations between Netanyahu and Donald Trump. This detail is vital. When the United States enters the scene, the whole world enters as well, because energy chains, markets, and military alliances tremble. And Europe, even when it tries to distance itself, ends up being dragged along by security interests and public opinion pressure. The question is, if the prophecy describes coalitions, is what is happening with Iran the thread that weaves together larger alliances, preparing something that goes far beyond a regional war? There is another aspect of what is happening with Iran that many people ignore: internal instability and economic strain. The report mentions currency devaluation and protests, revealing a regime under pressure from both outside and inside simultaneously. When a nation enters this situation, it becomes more prone to two movements: tightening internal control and amplifying narratives of external threats to maintain cohesion. And here, apocalypse comes into play again. Control, in the end, is not just military, it is economic and social. The world is moving toward normalizing surveillance, tracking, and damage control as the price of security. And conflicts, like the one in Iran, are accelerating this acceptance. In South America, where economic crises often generate a desire for immediate order, this type of trend is even more dangerous because exhausted societies accept control in exchange for stability. In other words, Iran may be geographically distant from part of the public, but the effects of the conflict could push the entire planet in the same direction of control. The burning question is, what if Iran is not just the problem, but the perfect argument for the world to justify a system that Revelation already described? Many ask, where does Daniel fit into this, besides mentioning Persia? Daniel comes in showing the pattern of empires. They rise, dominate, seem inevitable, and then are replaced. Ancient Persia, which ruled in its own way, fell when the next stage of the historical chessboard arrived, and Daniel had already foreseen this change before it happened. This message destroys modern idolatry of power. No regime is definitive, no plan is eternal, no threat is the end for those who understand that God reigns. And this is crucial to the Iran issue. Panic makes people think that everything depends on missiles and leaders, but prophecy shows that history depends on a greater decree. At the same time, Daniel is also used by Jesus when he speaks of a decisive point linked to the profanation of the sacred, a kind of spiritual turning point that separates those who only follow headlines from those who discern the times. The world looks at Iran and sees a threat. Jesus looks at the world and sees growing deception, growing fear, and hearts being tested. So the question is inevitable. When Iran pushes the world to the limit, who will appear offering peace? And what will be the price of that peace? One detail of the recent report is the mention of little progress in agreements to restrict the nuclear program and missile arsenal, and this maintains the climate of instability. The same report cites threats and harsh words, which increases the constant rumor of war. And here we return to the pattern of Matthew chapter 24, cited in the file about 2025. Wars and rumors as an environment, not as a single event. When the environment becomes the norm, people accept radical changes in the name of survival. This is a silent engine for the world to move toward the kind of scenario that Revelation describes: economic coercion, forced worship, and persecution against those who do not bow to the system. And this system doesn't have to start as tyranny. It can start as a global security plan, protection against terrorism, or control against proliferation. Iran, with its symbolic role as a nuclear threat, becomes the perfect argument for this advancement, even when the stated objective is peace. And this is the prophetic warning. The world will demand control and will call control a virtue. The question is simple. When security becomes a religion, how many will realize that their hearts have already shifted their focus? Now, connect the regions, because this channel is global. In the Middle East, Iran remains tied to the conflict with Israel and the regional anxiety described in recent reports and news. In the United States, decisions by the Donald Trump administration influence how this conflict is contained or escalated. And the report itself places this issue at the center of conversations with Netanyahu. In Europe, economic pressures, security concerns, and debates about digital identity show that the continent is moving towards integrated systems, which aligns with the prophetic theme of control. In South America, crises and instability make societies more vulnerable to accepting control in exchange for stability. And this is precisely how global systems gain traction. And then there's the Asian axis, with China and Russia observing, calculating and expanding their advantages in a divided world, reminiscent of the climate described in the file on global tensions and preparation for larger conflicts. None of this is about setting dates. It's about recognizing patterns. And here's the final blow. Ezekiel mentions Persia as part of a coalition. But the prophecy makes it clear that God intervenes, and that the pride of nations does not end in victory, but in confrontation with God himself. The question is the world preparing to confront an enemy, or to confront the Lord without realizing it? If Iran appears as Persia in Ezekiel chapter 38, this does not mean that every piece of news is already the final fulfillment, but it does mean that there is a prophetic pattern in which Persia is included. And what we saw in 2025, with reported direct conflict, attacks, and retaliations, gives the world the feeling that this model may be approaching a recognizable form. At the same time, the International Atomic Energy Agency appears in analyses as an element of pressure and concern regarding safeguards and enrichment, which makes the topic even more explosive. All of this increases the risk of escalation, and the global fear is not just military, it's existential, because it threatens energy, the economy, and stability. And that's exactly how the spirit of the times changes. People begin to accept the unthinkable, and they call it maturity, progress, realism. Apocalypse describes a world that reaches the point of deciding who buys and who sells, and this doesn't arise from nothing. It arises from years of accumulated crisis and continuous fear. Iran then becomes a symbol, the symbol of the danger that justifies everything. When the world uses Iran to justify greater control, who will realize that the prophecy always spoke of the system, not of headlines? The time has come to face the most serious point. What is happening with Iran is not just about Iran. The recent scenario described in the news shows that the Iran-Israel conflict is dragging in major powers, straining diplomacy, and creating internal and external instability. The prophetic scenario, in turn, shows that Persia appears linked to a coalition against Israel, and that God responds to this movement with intervention and judgment. The purpose of the biblical warning is not to create paranoia, but to call for repentance before the world hardens completely. And here is the hope. The same text that describes judgment also points out that God can restore, and this breaks the fatalistic narrative that only destruction remains. In other words, prophecy is not meant to turn the public into war supporters. It is meant to transform the public into awakened people who understand that empires rise and fall, but the soul remains before God. The final deception will not come disguised as pure evil, but as a solution, and Jesus warned that deception would be the great battlefield. So, the question for you is, if the world panics over Iran and accepts any political savior who promises order, will you recognize the spiritual risk, or will you applaud along with them? The prophecy that explains Iran begins with a simple word: Persia. She shows that this nation was once an instrument of liberation, but it also appears linked to a future coalition against Israel in Ezekiel chapter 38. And when one observes the recent scenario described in the news, direct conflict, tensions with the United States, Israel, and Europe, in addition to internal economic pressure, the world understands why Iran has become a geopolitical detonator. Daniel reminds us that empires seem eternal until the day God replaces them, and Revelation reminds us that the climax of the world is not just war, but control and a test of loyalty. None of this was written to generate dates, but rather to generate discernment. Before it's too late, the answer is not to idolize powers or live in fear. It is to return to Christ, because the prophecy ends with judgment on evil and hope for those who repent.